All right, people, so here we go. Chapter 22, Reconstruction. Before we get started, understand this is my first attempt at this. It might not be perfect. If you like it, great. If you don't, I guess that's too bad because I'm the teacher. Second of all, understand that I am sitting here in my brand new Hamilton shirt. It is a wondrous thing, and it's going to make this lecture even better. All right, so let's talk Chapter 22, Reconstruction here, okay? After the Civil War, the South really faces four different questions. And the first one is, how is the South rebuilt? Physically, emotionally, spiritually, economically, they are destroyed. What is the country going to do to rebuild the South? All right, we've already talked about the fact that the South is still poor today because of the Civil War. All right, so how are we as a union going to bring the South back in and rebuild it and make it a vital part of our country again? All right. Second, how are the liberated blacks going to fare as freemen? One of the great arguments was always, what are we going to do with the slaves after we free them? We talked about how there was a lot of ideas about sending them back to Africa. Very few people actually advocated for what's going to happen, which is they are going to live side by side with white people, with their former masters, and supposedly be integrated into the political and economic systems of the South. We know that's not going to work very well. We'll see some of the both attempts to try to make that work and some of the things that fought against it. How is the South going to be reintegrated back into the Union politically? The whole Civil War was fought. The South seceded from the Union, fought a war against the Union. Now, how are we going to bring the South back into the Union politically? And finally, who's going to direct all this Reconstruction? Are the Southern states going to be in charge of their own Reconstruction? Probably wouldn't have worked too well. Is the Congress going to be in charge of the Reconstruction? Or is the President going to be in charge of the Reconstruction? And that's going to be a serious conflict, which in the end is going to be one of the things which is going to lead to the first impeachment of a president, Andrew Johnson. All rebel leaders are pardoned by Andrew Johnson in 1868. They're not granted full citizenship. We'll talk about how they have to gain their citizenship. But all rebel leaders are pardoned. It was not real popular in the North in a lot of cases, but was probably a necessary step into bringing the South into the Union. Excuse me. So, what problems did the South face? Economically and socially, the South's in ruins. We talked a lot about leading up to the Civil War about the fact that the South needed slavery to really survive economically, but also as part of its culture. Slavery was very integrated into the culture of the South. Well, now it's gone. So economically, the South is in ruins, but socially, the South doesn't really quite know what to do with itself either. Banks, factories, railroads, we talked about all this, right? They didn't have very many banks. They didn't have very many factories. They didn't have very many railroads, and they didn't have real good roads in general. After the war, they're even worse. So how is the Union going to fix that problem or help the South fix that problem? Agricultural collapses with the loss of the slaves. The economic system was based on slavery. Without slavery, it doesn't work anymore. And the South remains defiant. It's not like after the Civil War, the South's like, yeah, we lost. Let's all figure it out. We'll come back in the Union. It'll be a great time. We'll all get along. That's not going to be what the South's like. So even though their agricultural system, cultural system, economic system all collapses without slavery, they're still going to remain defiant. All right. 3.5 million slaves are now free. Boom. All right, we know that's not going to happen immediately, but over time, 3.5 million slaves are now free and are supposed to be integrated into the South. Emancipation is a slow process. It didn't come immediately. All right, that's always really important to remember. It was a step-by-step process. Many blacks moved to cities. They formed conclaves within those cities. They lived with people where they're comfortable, and that's going to lead to overcrowding and a lot of other problems as we move on. The church becomes the focus of the black community, and education becomes a priority. We'll talk about a little bit about that later. All right, but the church is the focus of the black community. That remains true for a lot of African Americans today, and education was a priority for the freed slaves. The black codes, like we talked about in the past, made it illegal to teach the children of slaves, or slaves themselves, excuse me, to read or write. All right, now that they have that opportunity, freed slaves want that for their children. It's not going to be an accident that a lot of the focus, both during Reconstruction, but also during the Civil Rights era, is going to be on education. That's not an accident. On March 3rd, 1865, we get the foundation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is going to be an attempt to provide social welfare. It's led by a guy named Oliver Howard. For the most part, it's not going to be real successful. However, there are going to be some successes, most notably in education. However, most black are going to become sharecroppers. We're going to talk about sharecropping. They're unable to acquire land of their own. Many of them end up sharecropping for their former masters, and in a lot of cases, their lives aren't going to get a whole lot better outside of the obvious benefit of being free. All right. President Johnson wasn't in favor of the Freedmen's Bureau. We're going to see he's going to have his own ideas of how we're going to go about Reconstruction, and it's going to expire in 1872. All right, if you read page 485, there's a pretty decent summary of Johnson's opinions of the Freedmen's Bureau. All right, the South wasn't real obviously in favor of the Freedmen's Bureau either. All right, the whole idea is that the slaves aren't being forced to work for what they get. Plenty to eat and nothing to do. All right. The idea that they're just sitting around, they're taking all the food, they're not doing anything, they're not working hard. Guys, it's not a whole lot different than some of the arguments we see against welfare today. The whole idea that they're just taking and taking and taking, and they're not actually adding anything, in this case, to Southern culture. All right, the 13th Amendment is ratified in December of 1865. All right, basically outlaws slavery except as punishment for crime, which is going to be really important as we move on. We're going to see that there are going to be high rates of arrest of freed slaves in the South. All right, and then they're going to be used as basically slaves, right? They're going to be put to work, forced to go back to work for little or no pay. All right, but that's okay under the 13th Amendment. That's going to be real controversial over the years. All right, one of the key parts of the 13th Amendment, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The 13th Amendment says that Congress has the right to make sure that slavery is illegal, and that's going to be important. All right. A lot of Northern abolitionists are going to go south in order to try to help the freed slaves. They're obviously not going to be really welcomed by the South. The white Southern Democrats, and we talked about the fact that the Democratic Party split into two, so now we have this Southern Democratic Party is going to refer to them as carpetbaggers. It's going to see them as opportunists. All right, in this particular cartoon, you can actually, I don't know, hopefully you guys can see it. It actually says that this particular person is actually from Wisconsin going to the South. All right, the Wade Davis bill is going to be really interesting. All right, in 1860, Lincoln endorses what he calls a 10% plan. Again, how are we going to get the states back into the Union? And basically, Lincoln says the 10% plan says if a state citizens take an oath of allegiance, and 10% of the state citizens take an oath of allegiance to the Union and pledge to abide by emancipation, they will be readmitted into the Union. That's Lincoln's idea. All right, 1864, the Wade Davis bill calls for 50%. 50% of the people have to take this oath of allegiance. Almost an impossible number to get. All right, Lincoln's going to veto it. The Republicans are going to be outraged. All hell's going to break loose, and it's just going to be crazy. All right. Notice that already in 1860, before the start of the Civil War, Lincoln's already thinking about how is he going to bring the South back into the war after the war, all right? It speaks a little bit to Lincoln's ability to look beyond what's right in front of him. One of the things that made him a pretty successful president, all right? Congress is, they want to stick it to the South, all right? We're going to get a split in the Republican Party now. We're going to get the radical Republicans that want to stick it to the South. They hate the South. They hate the war. They blame the South for the war. They think the Southern are a bunch of backwoods hicks that are racist, and they want to stick it to them, all right? They don't want them back in the Union. All right, which is what the Wade Davis bill is all about. They knew that was probably an impossible number to get. They don't want them back in the Union. All right, the moderates, Republicans, are going to be more along the lines of Lincoln. All right, saying that we understand that the war was over. We want to make sure that there's some process to the South rejoining the Union, but we're not going to make it impossible. All right, after Lincoln's death, Johnson is going to take over. All right, Johnson is going to agree to the 10% plan, and he's going to begin readmitting Southern states. That's going to be a little controversial, all right? And we'll talk about that as we move on. Okay, President Andrew Johnson is not Lincoln, all right? He's a Jacksonian Democrat, All right, he was anti-aristocratic. He was a white supremacist. His whole idea was that the states had never legally left the Union, which is why he's pretty easy about getting them back into the Union. His famous quote is, "Damn the Negroes, I'm fighting those traitorous aristocrats, their masters." All right, he was not fighting for the slaves. He was fighting against the masters. All right. Notice he was a Jacksonian Democrat. He was one of those vice presidents that was brought into the administration to try to get votes. All right. Lincoln's also going to be relatively famous for bringing people in that do not necessarily agree with him. Probably the most famous Lincoln biography is called uh, the typical me, right? I can't remember. A Party of Rivals or something along those lines. I'm gonna look it up because it's driving me nuts. I can't remember, but that's not a surprise, right? We'll figure that out later. All right. There's going to be black codes that are going to be passed now because we have to decide what do we do with these freed slaves. Well, Southern legislators are immediately going to pass laws on how do we deal with the free slaves. So we're going to get a whole new set of black codes, right? They're designed to regulate the affairs of the newly freed blacks. All right. There's strict labor contracts that ensure a stable let's try that again. Ensured a stable, subservient labor force. And it's very close to slavery, right? In order for this southern economy to work, they need a stable labor force to harvest the cotton and the other crops in the South. All right, so strict labor contracts are going to allow that to happen. It's going to limit black freedoms. They're not allowed to serve in a jury. They're not allowed to own land. They're not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to do anything. Basically, the black codes are trying to return the freed, and I'm doing air quotes and I know you can't see them, slaves back to a type of slavery. All right, blacks are going to fall into the status of sharecroppers and they're going to remain there for generations. All right, one of the things that's important as we go through and we look at African American culture and the struggles of African Americans to lift themselves out of poverty as a race, not as individuals, but as an entire race, it's important to remember, yeah, the Civil War was 150 years ago. All right, but they're going to fall into a lot of the same statuses with sharecropping and the black codes all the way up until the 1960s when the civil rights movement is going to force more freedom in the South. That's always really important to remember. All right. Because the Confederate leaders are pardoned, they can now run for office. Because blacks are generally not allowed to vote for the South, they win. All right, so we get many former Confederate leaders among the congressmen, including 4 Confederate generals, 5 Confederate colonels, 58 former Richmond cabinet Congress members. Remember, that was the capital of the Confederacy. All right, are now going to be into the U.S. Congress. Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president, all right, was also elected, vice president of the Confederacy, excuse me, was also elected to Congress, even though he was still under indictment for treason. All right, so this speaks to the problem that the Union has with what do we do with these people? Yeah, they're pardoned, but they might be treasonous, and they're coming back into the legislature, but blacks haven't been allowed to vote, and what do we do? All right, all of these obviously are going to be Democrats. All right, the funny thing is because as slaves go, funny, not funny, haha, but funny, ironic, as slaves go from 3/5 of a person under the 3/5 clause to now full citizens, so now they count as a whole person, the South actually going to gain seats in Congress. They're going to gain electoral college votes. They're going to gain political strength. So the South is actually stronger in some ways politically after the war than they were before it. In June 1866, we get the Civil Rights Bill, which is going to become the 14th Amendment. Blacks are still not going to really be allowed to vote. That's going to be a long process, which really isn't solved until at least the 1960s. Some people would argue it's still being fought today. All right, 10 of the 11 southern states are going to reject the 14th Amendment, but the 1966 election is going to give Republicans a veto-proof 2/3 majority. All right, so they're going to be able to pass it through the legislature, not through the states. All right, just give you a quick map of how the states are re-entered into the Union. All right, we're going to get the black numbers, their readmission to the Union. So, for example, Texas was readmitted to the Union in 1870. All right, Alabama in 1868, South Carolina in 1868, Virginia 1870. You also see that we're divided into these into military districts. All right, and that's going to be important when we look at some of the things that are going to come forward. All right, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 divides the South into those military districts, and they're commanded by Union troops. So we're still going to have Union troops in the South. All right, this is going to defranchise thousands of Confederates. They're not going to be allowed to vote. All right, until they're actually readmitted into the Union, which means they have to take the oath of loyalty to the Union, the whole 10% plan, and that's going to take a little while, as we saw by the map in the last slide. All right. In order to get back into the Union, the South has to ratify the 14th Amendment. The states have to ratify the 14th Amendment. It's a rule, right? They don't get a choice. It's not like they say, all right, we're all loyal to the Union, but we don't want to ratify the 14th Amendment. In order to get into the Union, you had to ratify the 14th Amendment. All right. The 14th Amendment gives states the right to protect black rights. All right. The federal government did not want to be involved in having to go into the South and constantly protect black rights, which obviously they're going to have to do all the way up till today, some people would say. All right. But they want to free the federal government from that responsibility, so it gives the states the right to protect black rights. That is not good. All right, the 15th Amendment comes next, 1869. It gives black suffrage, still denies women. That's going to be a real hot topic with women. It's really going to kind of kickstart a new generation of women suffragists that are going to demand the right to vote. All right, by 1870, all southern states are fully readmitted. And then we get the Compromise of 1876. It's an electoral fight between Tilden and Hayes. All right, that's going to result in the federal troops leaving the South. We'll talk about that more specifically in a bit. The South is going to revert to white democratic rule, also known as home rule or home rulers. All right, Southerners were incensed that black could now vote and hold office, why some Confederates could not, right? Some Confederates were still not allowed to vote, were not allowed to hold office. We know that in reality, many of them were allowed to vote, and in reality, many of them are going to end up holding office. But again, it's propaganda, right? Now they're saying, well, now you're going to allow our slaves to vote, but you're not going to allow our brave soldiers to vote. It just doesn't play well, and it's going to lead to a lot more problems in the South. All right. We also get the Ku Klux Klan, which is founded in Tennessee in 1866. It's founded specifically to terrorize and intimidate blacks in the South, to stop them from claiming their rights, voting rights in particular, but also their other rights as well. Notice it was 1866, which was after Django Unchained. For those of you Django Unchained fans, all right, the whole cool thing where they couldn't see out of the holes in their cloaks. Probably not historically accurate. Don't get your history from Quentin Tarantino, even though he makes awesome movies. All right. The Ku Klux Klan obviously is going to believe in white supremacy. All right. This fight with radical Republicans is actually going to end up leading to Johnson's impeachment, right? Johnson wants this 10% plan. He wants to be relatively easy on the South. He wants to allow the South to re-enter the Union. Again, remember, he really felt that legally they had never left the Union. All right. The radical Republicans are not going to be about treating the South right. All right. In 1868, Jackson's going to break a very obscure law. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. It basically says that you cannot fire a cabinet member. The president can't fire a cabinet member. All right. Probably an unconstitutional law. The Constitution gives the president the right to choose the cabinet. Kind of as part of that, implied is that he then has the right to get rid of him because he can choose somebody else. All right, but the Congress had passed a law that said that the president could not fire a member of his cabinet, probably specifically because they knew Johnson would violate it. A lot of historians believe that this is all tied up in an attempt to get him to break a law to give them a reason to impeach him. So he fires Secretary of War Stanton. Congress actually votes to impeach, 126 to 47. Now, what ends up happening is the Democrats and the radical Republicans join together to vote to impeach President Johnson. All right, remember, impeach does not mean kicked out of office. That's something that's really important to remember. All right, we've had two presidents impeached, right? President Johnson and President Clinton, both impeached. All right, neither of them is going to be kicked out of office. We've never had a president actually kicked out of office. Nixon's going to resign, probably would have been actually removed from office, but impeachment is basically like an indictment in court. All right, it then goes to the Senate. The Senate tries them. Again, it's only happened once. President Johnson was impeached by the House, tried by the Senate. He avoids actually being kicked out of office, by 1 vote. I don't like the fact that I use the word impeachment there, guys. Sorry. It should probably say Jonathan Boyd getting kicked out of office or being removed from office by 1 vote in the Senate. All right. Same thing's going to happen to Clinton. Clinton's going to be impeached. He's going to have a trial in the Senate. He'll win that trial easily. Even more so in Clinton's case, it was a very split. Republicans controlled the House, so they could impeach him. Democrats controlled the Senate, so they could make sure he wasn't removed from office. All right. One last real quick thing here, guys. It's really important that he does not get removed from office. A lot of historians believe that if he gets removed from office, then all of a sudden this idea of impeachment becomes a political tool. All right, not necessarily what it was probably put into place for was to get rid of somebody who broke the law. All right, a lot of people think that if Johnson ends up getting removed from office, then it becomes a political tool. And anytime somebody controls both the House and the Senate, a political party controls both the House and the Senate, they're going to be able to remove the president from office, which is not something that we want to make a common occurrence. All right, Alaska happens during this time too. All right, it's purchased from Russia in 1867 by Secretary of State Seward, $7.2 million. People are like, what the heck are we buying this ice cube for? It's called Seward's Folly. People are going to be really upset right up until the time they find gold and oil in Alaska, and it ends up being a very good thing. All right, before you come into class, all right, before you come into class on Monday, all right, remember this particular video is due on Friday. Before you come into class on Monday, all right, make a list, just make a T-chart, things that were successful for Reconstruction and things that were failures of Reconstruction. All right, and you can kind of think all the way up until the present as we go through that, because if you look at the South now, there are definitely some things that came out of Reconstruction. All right. As we do that, prepare to support one of two views. Either Reconstruction was generally successful in restoring the Union and guaranteeing black rights, or the Old South was more resurrected than it was reconstructed. In other words, basically, not a whole heck of a lot changes. That's our video. Hope you enjoy it. Take good notes, and we'll go from there.